The cafe opened the way it always did, with the soft scrape of chairs being pulled from tables and the familiar hiss of the espresso machine waking from sleep. Morning light pressed through the front windows, catching dust in the air and turning it briefly golden before the day's routine swallowed it whole. Yet beneath the practiced motions and memorized smells, something felt uneven, like a rhythm played half a beat too fast. Aisha sensed it as she tied her apron, her fingers lingering on the knot longer than usual, as if delaying the moment when she would have to step fully into the day. Customers arrived in clusters rather than waves, their impatience showing in small ways. A tap of fingers on the counter, a glance at watches held too close to faces, sighs released without shame. The cafe had always been a place where time softened, where even hurried people slowed enough to breathe. Today, time seemed sharpened instead, cutting into everyone's movements. Aisha moved carefully between tables, her steps light, her eyes lowered in the habit she had never quite shaken, offering smiles that felt thinner than they should have. She felt responsible for the mood without knowing why, as if her quietness had somehow allowed it to spread. Behind the counter, the manager watched everything with a rigid stillness that unsettled her more than raised voices ever could. His jaw remained tight, his greetings clipped, his corrections sharper than usual. He polished the same spot on the counter again and again, as though pressure alone could erase whatever weighed on him. When Aisha brought him a fresh stack of cups, he nodded without looking up, and she noticed the faint tremor in his hands. It was a small detail, but it lodged in her thoughts, growing heavier with each passing minute. The absence of Mr. Saad hung over the cafe like a shadow cast by something just out of sight. He had not been present for weeks, and while his physical absence was nothing new, the silence surrounding it was. Normally, his rare visits were spoken of in whispers and fond exaggerations, stories of a man who owned more than he ever showed and noticed more than he ever said. Now, there were only rumors, passed from staff to customers and back again, mutating with each retelling. Some said the cafe was being sold, others that it had already been promised away to a faceless corporation that would strip it of its warmth. Aisha tried not to listen, but fragments reached her anyway, settling uneasily in her chest. This cafe had been her refuge when she first arrived in the city, a place that did not ask too many questions of a girl who preferred silence to explanation. The thought of it changing hands felt personal, like a quiet betrayal of everything it had offered her. As she wiped tables and refilled sugar jars, she found herself touching the worn edges of furniture, memorizing their textures, as if preparing to say goodbye without being told she needed to. Her gentleness, once an unnoticed part of the cafe's atmosphere, now stood in contrast to the tension tightening the room. Where others moved quickly and spoke sharply, she slowed, offering patience in small, deliberate gestures. She waited an extra second before interrupting a customer, adjusted a chair so it would not scrape too loudly, lowered her voice when taking orders. These acts did not change the mood, but they softened its edges, creating brief pockets of calm that passed almost as soon as they formed. As the morning stretched on, the pressure of expectation became heavier. Regulars who once lingered now left quickly, casting disappointed looks behind them. New customers seemed confused by the strained smiles and hurried service, sensing a discord they could not name. The cafe was still full, still functioning, but its heart felt distracted, pulled toward worries that had no clear shape. Aisha felt it in her breathing, shallow and careful, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space in a room already crowded with uncertainty. She wondered about Mr. Saad more than she ever had before. She had seen him only a handful of times, a tall man with an unassuming presence that contrasted sharply with the wealth whispered about him. When he had spoken to her, it had been with an attentiveness that made her feel briefly visible, not examined but acknowledged. His absence now felt louder than his presence ever had, a reminder of how fragile stability could be when it depended on someone unseen. By late morning, the initial rush had faded, leaving behind a tired quiet that settled unevenly over the cafe. The manager finally exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to be noticeable. He dismissed a server early, citing low traffic, and the words landed heavily, hinting at decisions yet to come. Aisha cleaned her section slowly, aware of every sound, every shift of light, as if the room itself were watching her. When she finally paused, standing near the window with a tray held close to her chest, she allowed herself a moment to feel everything she had been holding back. The unease, the rumors, the fear of change pressed together, but beneath them was something steadier. The café had weathered quieter storms before, carried by the small kindnesses exchanged within its walls. Aisha believed, perhaps naively, that gentleness still mattered, that it could anchor a place even when ownership and power loomed overhead. As she returned to her work, she carried that belief with her, letting it settle like a calm breath, enough to close the morning with a sense of fragile, necessary hope. It was not certainty nor courage, but a quiet willingness to remain present, to keep serving warmth one cup at a time, trusting that continuity itself could become resistance against the cold logic of profit and haste that threatened to redefine value without remembering people entirely. The café no longer felt surprised by tension. It had begun to wear it as a constant layer, thin but persistent, like dust that returned no matter how often surfaces were wiped. Aisha noticed it the moment she stepped inside, before the smell of coffee fully reached her. Voices carried differently now, lower yet sharper, as if people were afraid of being overheard and resentful of that fear at the same time. She tied her apron slowly, grounding herself in the routine, but her attention drifted toward the counter, where the manager leaned in close to another supervisor. Speaking in a voice meant not to travel. She did not intend to listen, yet certain words broke free, landing with weight. Absence. Unreachable. No timeline. The manager's expression held a seriousness she had not seen before. Not the stress of a busy shift, but something deeper, edged with uncertainty. Aisha felt her chest tighten as she pretended to adjust a stack of menus, her ears betraying her intentions. The owner's name was spoken softly, almost cautiously, as though saying it too loudly might make the situation worse. When the conversation ended, the manager straightened abruptly, his composure returning like a mask pulled back into place. Customers sensed the undercurrent even without details. Regulars leaned toward each other, their murmurs mixing with the clink of cups and saucers. Some speculated with casual curiosity, treating the situation like entertainment, while others spoke with concern sharpened by familiarity. Aisha caught fragments as she passed tables, theories layered upon theories, each one more certain than the last despite lacking proof. The café, once a place of shared comfort, now felt like a vessel carrying too many unspoken questions, all pressing against its walls. Among the staff, fear settled in quieter ways. One server counted tables repeatedly, as if numbers could predict security. Another lingered in the back, wiping already clean surfaces, avoiding eye contact. Jobs here had always felt modest but stable, a rare balance in a city that demanded speed and offered little mercy. The idea that it could all vanish without warning stirred a shared anxiety that no one quite named. Aisha felt it too, a small ache beneath her ribs, growing heavier with each rumor she overheard. Her instinct was to soften what she could. She refilled cups before being asked, offered gentle reassurances without promising anything she did not know. Her voice stayed calm, her movements unhurried, even as her thoughts raced. She reminded co-workers to breathe, to focus on the moment in front of them. Some responded with grateful smiles, others with distracted nods, but the effort mattered to her. Compassion, she believed, did not require certainty. It only required presence. Yet beneath her calm exterior, confusion churned. She wondered how someone as present, however distant, as the owner could simply disappear from conversation, from decision, from reassurance. Mr. Saad had always existed at the edge of her awareness, not as a figure of wealth but as a steady anchor whose values seemed quietly woven into the café's culture. His absence now felt like a removal of that anchor, leaving everyone drifting slightly, unsure of direction. As the day progressed, the café's warmth dimmed further, not extinguished but muted. Laughter came less easily. Music played, but it felt like background noise rather than accompaniment. Aisha wiped the counter and noticed how the wood no longer gleamed the way it used to, dulled by constant touch and neglected care. It seemed symbolic, a small reflection of what uncertainty could do when left unattended. She found herself watching the door more often, half expecting it to open and resolve everything with a simple explanation. Each time it didn't. A quiet disappointment followed, brief but insistent. Still, she continued her work, aware that stability was now something they created for each other rather than something guaranteed from above. The class divide that once felt abstract now pressed closer, reminding her how easily decisions made far away could reshape lives lived close together. By evening, exhaustion settled over the staff, heavier than usual. The manager gathered them briefly, offering reassurances that sounded practiced, careful not to promise too much. Aisha listened, holding on to the tone rather than the words, sensing the effort it took to project calm while feeling none. When the meeting ended, no one lingered. They returned to their tasks with subdued focus, the shared silence speaking louder than any announcement. As closing time approached, the café emptied slowly, leaving behind the familiar mess of crumbs and cups, tangible evidence that life had continued despite uncertainty. Aisha cleaned methodically, letting the repetition soothe her. She knew tomorrow would bring more questions, more speculation, more quiet fear. For now, she allowed herself a small moment of acceptance. The warmth had not vanished entirely. It waited, fragile but present, sustained by those willing to care even when answers were absent. The afternoon settled into the café with a muted calm, the kind that followed days of unease rather than busy mornings. Light filtered through the windows without warmth, resting on tables already cleared, revealing scratches and stains long ignored. Aisha moved through the quiet space with measured steps, listening to the hum of machines and the distant city outside. Her thoughts stayed guarded, shaped by recent uncertainty, yet she clung to routine as if it could still protect something fragile. The café felt alert, waiting, as though it sensed an arrival before the door even moved that would soon come. A man entered quietly, unnoticed by most, the bell above the door barely reacting to his presence. He wore plain clothes, clean but unremarkable, colors chosen to blend rather than impress. His posture suggested awareness without arrogance, as if he understood how spaces worked and adjusted himself accordingly. Aisha noticed him immediately, not because he demanded attention, but because he seemed to avoid it too deliberately. He scanned the room briefly, eyes steady, then took a seat near the window where light softened faces and kept his hands folded calmly before him as minutes passed in silence without visible impatience. Aisha approached with practiced ease, notebook held lightly, her expression neutral but observant. She sensed something unusual, a faint tension that did not match his polite stillness. It reminded her of moments before rain, when the air shifted without explanation. She dismissed the feeling, telling herself that uncertainty had sharpened her imagination lately. Customers came and went, each carrying their own quiet weight. Still, her attention returned to him as she waited for his order, aware of her own breathing slowing in the space between expectation and routine where small details often felt amplified by recent days of strain alone. He ordered simply, his voice calm and measured, choosing an item that required no explanation. There was no curiosity in his tone about the café's history or offerings, no attempt to engage beyond necessity. Aisha appreciated the restraint, sensing respect rather than indifference. She wrote the order carefully, noting how little space he took with his words. Luxury surrounded him quietly, polished surfaces and subtle music, yet he behaved as if none of it mattered, allowing the place to exist without comment or claim as though familiarity had taught him restraint long before this ordinary afternoon inside shared public spaces. As she prepared his drink, Aisha felt an unexpected pull, not attraction but recognition, subtle and unsettling. It was the sense of standing near someone shaped by different pressures, someone accustomed to control yet practicing humility. She did not know why the thought occurred, and she pushed it aside. Her hands focused on the task, steam rising, scent spreading. The café responded briefly, warmth flickering back into the room through routine and care. Even uncertainty paused, held at bay by repetition that reminded her why she stayed despite fear and limited choice within systems larger than herself quietly demanding endurance. When she returned to his table, she placed the cup gently, avoiding unnecessary contact. Their eyes met for a moment, brief but steady, and something unreadable passed between them. He thanked her softly, attention already drifting back inward. Aisha nodded and stepped away, aware of a lingering awareness she could not name. She reminded herself that connection could be imagined, born from stress and longing rather than truth. The mind searched for meaning when stability weakened, and ordinary encounters felt briefly significant under pressure of uncertain futures that refused to stay theoretical inside daily work and silence shared by many. The man remained for a while, drinking slowly, observing little. He did not reach for his phone, did not signal impatience. Aisha noticed how he blended into the background despite his presence, as if practiced at being overlooked. Other customers treated him as ordinary, which seemed to please him. The café accepted him without reaction, its tension neither easing nor worsening. It simply adjusted, accommodating one more quiet figure within its walls already heavy with concern and shaped by forces unseen yet powerful, moving lives without ceremony or acknowledgement from those affected until consequences quietly arrived, routine disguised as normalcy. Aisha kept her distance, professionalism anchoring her reactions. She did not linger, did not search for signs confirming her earlier instinct. The café had taught her restraint, the value of not assuming importance where none was offered. Still, she felt changed in a small way, as if a quiet mirror had been placed briefly before her. She continued serving others, the afternoon folding inward, holding its secrets gently. Uncertainty no longer felt abstract but personal, tied to faces and fleeting moments that hinted at larger truths beyond sight without revealing them outright to those living within fragile balance of work. When the man finally left, the bell rang softly, barely noticed. Nothing dramatic followed, no shift obvious enough to name. Yet the café felt subtly altered, like a room after someone meaningful has passed through. Aisha cleared his table last, slower than necessary. She accepted that some encounters mattered not because of answers, but because they reminded her that calm and power could exist quietly together, without spectacle or demand for recognition in spaces shaped by labor and patience rather than wealth openly displayed or authority loudly announced at the expense of dignity shared quietly among ordinary people every day. Closing time approached with the usual motions, but Aisha felt steadier than she had earlier. The uncertainty remained, unresolved, yet her fear softened into something manageable. She wiped counters, stacked chairs, and breathed through the silence. The café still stood, imperfect and tense, but alive. As lights dimmed, she carried with her the quiet assurance that not all influence announced itself loudly, and that gentleness could still endure within systems that often overlooked it and moments that passed without recognition yet shaped lives in lasting ways through patience rather than force, waiting quietly to be seen when time allowed space. The man returned on a quieter morning, choosing the same corner where shadows softened faces and sound arrived gently. From there, the café unfolded before him like a contained world, ordinary yet intricate. He did not announce himself, did not expect recognition. Instead, he observed, letting the space speak in its own language. Aisha moved through the room with the same restrained grace he remembered, her presence steady without drawing attention. She greeted customers with an ease that felt earned rather than practiced, as if respect were her natural posture toward others, not a requirement of her job. He watched how she handled each table differently without changing herself. With impatient guests, she listened fully, absorbing frustration without reflecting it back. With the elderly regulars, she slowed her pace, bending slightly to meet them where they were. Even difficult customers, sharp with entitlement or weary from lives heavier than their words suggested, softened under her calm consistency. There was no performance in her kindness. It was quiet, almost invisible, but persistent enough to shape the room around her, smoothing tensions before they hardened into conflict. Aisha did not notice him watching, or if she did, she gave no sign. Her focus stayed on the work, on people who needed small attentions that rarely felt small to those receiving them. She wiped spills before they were mentioned, refilled cups at the right moment, remembered preferences without making a show of it. The café responded to her presence subtly. Conversations eased, shoulders lowered, impatience dissolved into tolerance. It was not magic, he realized, but intention repeated often enough to become atmosphere. From his corner, the man felt an unexpected discomfort grow. It was not shame exactly, but something close to it, a recognition of distance he had long accepted as necessary. His life had been built on efficiency, delegation, and decisions made far from their consequences. He had convinced himself that structure replaced warmth, that systems mattered more than moments. Watching Aisha, he saw the flaw in that belief. The café functioned not because of ownership or strategy, but because of countless small choices made with care by people who expected little in return. He noticed details he had once overlooked. The worn edges of tables polished smooth by years of use, the mismatched chairs kept sturdy through constant repair, the way light pooled differently depending on the hour. None of it was luxurious in the way his world defined value, yet it held a richness that resisted measurement. This place survived not through profit alone, but through relationships, through the quiet agreement that everyone belonged for the time they were there. That realization unsettled him more than any financial risk ever had. Aisha paused briefly near his table while adjusting a nearby chair. Their eyes met again, and this time he felt the weight of it more clearly. There was no expectation in her gaze, no curiosity about who he might be beyond the moment. She offered a polite nod, nothing more, and moved on. The simplicity of the exchange lingered. He felt seen without being examined, acknowledged without being elevated. It struck him how rare that feeling had become in his life, how often attention came attached to motive or advantage. As the morning progressed, he continued to watch, each small interaction deepening his unease. Aisha laughed softly with a child who had spilled juice, turning embarrassment into relief. She listened patiently to a complaint she could not fix, offering understanding instead of excuses. These moments did not change the world, but they changed the room, and perhaps that was enough. He felt a growing guilt for having treated the café as an asset rather than a living space shaped by human effort and emotional labor that never appeared on balance sheets. He thought about his absence, how easily he had stepped away, assuming the structure would hold without him. From this corner, he saw the cost of that distance, the anxiety that crept in when leadership became silent. The café was more than a line in a portfolio. It was a place where people invested parts of themselves daily, trusting in a stability that depended on decisions made elsewhere. That trust now felt heavier, more personal, because he could see the faces behind it, particularly hers. Aisha finished her shift tasks with the same care she gave customers, stacking cups neatly, wiping counters until they reflected light again. There was no resentment in her movements, no visible fear, only persistence. He wondered how many like her existed within his enterprises, carrying unseen weight while remaining invisible to those with authority. The thought unsettled him deeply. Success had insulated him from these realities, allowing him to believe that good intentions at a distance were sufficient. When he finally stood to leave, the café felt warmer than when he arrived, not because circumstances had changed, but because he had allowed himself to see differently. He left quietly, as he had come, but the space followed him in a way he did not expect. Outside, the city resumed its pace, indifferent and loud. Yet the café remained with him, a reminder that value could not always be scaled, that dignity often lived in unnoticed places, sustained by people like Aisha who asked for little and gave consistency instead. By the time the door closed behind him, he understood something he had avoided for years. The café was not simply a business awaiting resolution. It was a small world held together by human warmth, fragile yet resilient. And within that world, his responsibility was no longer abstract. It was present, immediate, and quietly demanding attention he could no longer postpone without consequence to himself or those who trusted in structures he had built. The manager noticed the man before he understood why. It was not the clothes, which were deliberately ordinary, nor the way he ordered, which revealed nothing unusual. It was the stillness. The café was a place of motion, of small constant adjustments. Yet the man seemed to occupy his corner without disturbing anything, as if he had learned long ago how to observe without participating. The manager's eyes returned to him again and again, irritation growing into something sharper. Experience had taught him that trouble often arrived quietly, disguised as patience. He watched how long the man stayed, how his gaze traveled not toward the menu or the register, but toward the staff, lingering just long enough to feel intentional. The manager told himself it was paranoia, born from weeks of uncertainty and rumor, but the feeling did not fade. In times like these, when ownership felt distant and stability fragile, even harmless anomalies felt dangerous. He wiped his hands on a cloth and adjusted his posture, scanning the cafe as if searching for confirmation of a threat only he seemed to sense. Aisha felt his attention before he spoke to her. The manager called her aside near the counter, his voice low, careful not to carry. He did not accuse, but his concern was clear in the way he leaned closer than usual, eyes flicking briefly toward the corner. He reminded her to remain professional, to keep interactions brief, to avoid unnecessary familiarity. The words were measured, but beneath them lay fear. He mentioned competitors, journalists, people who thrived on vulnerability and rumors. In his world, curiosity was rarely innocent. Aisha listened, nodding respectfully, though confusion stirred within her. She had noticed the man, of course, but only as one notices any customer who does not demand attention. To her, his presence had felt calm, almost grounding, not invasive. Still, she trusted the manager's experience and understood his anxiety. The cafe was already fragile. The wrong attention could push it further into uncertainty. She promised to be careful, even as something inside her resisted the idea that caution must always override kindness. Returning to her tasks, Aisha felt a subtle tension settle in her chest. She moved through the cafe with the same gentleness, but now she monitored herself, measuring each interaction. The manager's warning echoed in her thoughts, reshaping her instincts. Where she would normally linger an extra moment to ensure comfort, she now stepped back sooner. Felt unnatural, like holding her breath too long. Her empathy did not disappear, but it pressed against boundaries newly drawn, reminding her how easily rules could interrupt care. The man remained in his corner, unchanged, unaware of the quiet shift his presence had caused. The manager watched him closely now, noting every movement, every glance. He imagined headlines, whispered accusations, consequences unfolding beyond his control. Responsibility weighed heavily on him. Protecting the cafe meant protecting its people, and in uncertain times, protection often meant restriction. He hated that reality, but he had learned that good intentions did not shield anyone from harm. Aisha sensed the scrutiny without fully understanding it. She avoided the corner table more than necessary, assigning herself tasks elsewhere. When she did pass by, she kept her expression neutral, her steps efficient. Yet she could not entirely erase the feeling that something important was being misunderstood. The cafe thrived on trust, on the assumption that people came seeking warmth, not advantage. The manager's suspicion, though reasonable, felt like a crack in that foundation, small but unsettling. As the day wore on, the atmosphere tightened slightly, like a room anticipating bad news. Customers felt it too, their conversations subdued, their glances more alert. The cafe functioned, but its rhythm faltered. Aisha found herself torn between loyalty to the rules that protected her job and the values that had drawn her to this place. She wondered when caution became fear, and whether fear, once accepted, could quietly reshape who they were allowed to be. The manager finally relaxed his stance just enough to breathe, though his vigilance remained. He reminded himself that suspicion was a tool, not a verdict. Still, he resolved to stay alert until clarity returned. Too much was at stake to ignore his instincts. Watching Aisha, he felt a flicker of guilt. Her kindness was an asset, not a liability, yet circumstances forced him to treat it as something needing control. Leadership, he reflected bitterly, often meant choosing the lesser discomfort. As evening approached, the man finished his drink and left without incident. Nothing happened, No confrontation, no revelation. The manager exhaled slowly, tension draining from his shoulders. Perhaps he had overreacted. Perhaps uncertainty had sharpened his fears. Aisha noticed his relief and felt her own ease return, though questions lingered. She cleaned the table after the man's departure, her movements thoughtful. The space felt ordinary again, yet altered by the unspoken conflict that had passed through it. When closing time arrived, Aisha felt tired in a different way, not from work but from restraint. She had learned that day how fragile warmth could be when trust was questioned. Still, she accepted the balance she was asked to hold. The café remained standing, its people cautious but intact. As lights dimmed, she carried with her a quiet resolve to preserve kindness within limits, believing that even careful empathy could survive uncertainty, waiting patiently for a moment when it no longer had to apologize for existing at all. The note slipped from Aisha's apron as she bent to collect a fallen spoon, a small rectangle of paper drifting to the floor without sound. She noticed too late, straightening as the disguised man reached down instinctively and picked it up before she could stop him. For a moment, neither spoke. The café hummed around them, ordinary and unaware, while the paper rested between his fingers, its edges softened by handling. Aisha felt heat rush to her face, a quiet panic tightening her chest, because she recognized the handwriting immediately and knew what parts of herself it carried. He did not intend to read it. His eyes caught only a line, then another, before courtesy could intervene. The words were not polished or careful. They carried the uneven honesty of something written in solitude, meant for no audience. He saw struggle described without drama, exhaustion framed as routine, hope mentioned cautiously, like something fragile that survived only through restraint. The note spoke of gratitude towards someone who had once offered help without asking for anything in return, and beneath that gratitude lay loneliness shaped by long hours, limited choices, and the quiet dignity of endurance. Aisha reached for the paper, apologizing softly, her voice steady despite the vulnerability she felt exposed. He returned it immediately, murmuring regret, but the damage was already done. She folded the note quickly, tucking it away as if concealment could undo what had been revealed. For a brief second, she considered explaining, then decided against it. The café taught her that not every truth required clarification. Some truths simply existed whether seen or not. As she stepped away, the man remained still, the words lingering in his mind. He felt as though he had been handed a mirror he had never asked for but desperately needed. Her struggles contrasted sharply with the distance and insulation of his own life. He had resources, influence, options. She had perseverance, restraint, and a capacity for gratitude that survived scarcity. The imbalance unsettled him, not as guilt alone, but as responsibility newly clarified. He watched her move through the café again, attentive yet guarded, kindness intact despite the momentary breach. Knowing what he now knew changed everything. Her smiles carried weight, not performance. Her patience was not endless. It was chosen, renewed each time circumstances tested it. The café, already transformed in his eyes, now felt even more alive, shaped by hidden stories like hers, stories that rarely reached those with the power to alter outcomes. Aisha tried to steady herself through routine. She wiped the counter, refilled cups, avoided the corner where he sat. The note had been written during a quiet evening weeks earlier, a private acknowledgement of someone who had helped her when she arrived in the city with little more than determination. It was not meant to be read, certainly not by him. Yet part of her wondered if being seen, even accidentally, changed anything at all. Vulnerability felt dangerous, but it also felt honest. The man considered his response carefully. Words felt insufficient, especially spoken ones. He understood systems, contracts, gestures that carried weight beyond sentiment. Still, the note demanded something personal, something restrained yet meaningful. He took out a small card, plain and unmarked, and wrote slowly, choosing simplicity over explanation. He did not sign his name. He did not reveal intent. He wrote only acknowledgement, respect, and assurance that unseen efforts mattered more than she knew. When he rose to leave, He placed the card on the counter near her station, careful not to draw attention. Aisha noticed it after he had gone, the bell announcing his departure softly. She hesitated before picking it up, sensing its importance without knowing why. The card felt heavier than paper should. She opened it quietly, reading the brief lines that met her with unexpected gentleness. The words did not promise change, nor did they intrude upon her privacy. They simply reflected understanding, offering reassurance without obligation. Aisha felt her breath catch, emotion surfacing where she had learned to keep it contained. The note did not erase her struggles, but it acknowledged them, and that acknowledgement felt like warmth spreading slowly through a cold room. As the cafe settled into evening, Aisha tucked the card safely away. She returned to her work with renewed steadiness, carrying something fragile yet sustaining. The man walked into the city beyond, changed by what he had seen and read. Between them, nothing overt had passed, yet something essential had shifted. The cafe remained, imperfect and uncertain, but within it, connection had quietly rewritten what distance once protected, leaving room for responsibility to grow without spectacle. The note stayed with Aisha long after she slipped it into her apron pocket, its presence subtle but persistent, like a quiet warmth against her side. She finished her tasks with the same care as always, yet something within her had shifted, loosening a tightness she had grown accustomed to carrying. When the cafe briefly emptied between rushes, she reread the words in her mind rather than on paper, letting them settle without overthinking their origin. Gratitude, encouragement, respect. They were simple sentiments, but they felt rare, addressed to her not as a role but as a person. She did not know who had written it. That uncertainty brought confusion alongside comfort. The man's face surfaced in her thoughts, calm and observant, but she hesitated to attach meaning too quickly. Life had taught her restraint, the discipline of not assuming generosity where silence often followed. Still, the note had reached her in a way few things did. It recognized effort without demanding performance, acknowledging kindness as something real rather than expected. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen without having to explain herself. As she moved through the cafe, the room felt slightly altered, not brighter, but softer. The clatter of cups seemed less harsh, the hum of conversation less draining. She caught herself smiling faintly while wiping a table, then quickly composed herself, aware of how easily hope could become vulnerable. The note did not promise change, but it offered reassurance that her quiet presence mattered. That was enough to steady her, to remind her why she continued choosing patience even when it cost her energy she could not afford to waste. Across the room, the manager watched with a different kind of attention. His concern had not eased with the man's departure. If anything, it had sharpened. He noticed the subtle change in Aisha, the way she moved with renewed calm, and it unsettled him. In uncertain times, unexplained shifts felt dangerous. He replayed the man's behavior in his mind, cataloging details, searching for patterns. The stillness, the observation, the timing, none of it felt random. He began to consider possibilities he did not like. Journalists often disguised themselves as ordinary customers, gathering stories quietly. Competitors sought weaknesses, human angles they could exploit. The cafe's rumors, its vulnerable staff, its absent owner all made fertile ground for interference. The manager felt responsible for shielding the place from harm, even if that meant mistrusting those who seemed harmless. Leadership, he believed, required vigilance more than warmth, especially when stakes were unclear. Aisha sensed his gaze and felt a familiar tension return. She respected the manager, understood his fear, yet she could not reconcile it with the quiet gratitude she carried. The note had not crossed boundaries. It had not demanded anything. Still, she kept it hidden, unsure how to explain something so personal without inviting misunderstanding. The cafe existed on delicate balance now, and she did not want to tip it further by revealing an exchange that felt intimate despite its simplicity. As the day unfolded, the manager's worry took form in action. He adjusted schedules, reminded staff of protocols, reinforced expectations of professionalism. His voice remained calm, but his urgency showed in small ways, a clipped tone, a restless pace. He planned to review security footage, to consult with the owner's representatives if needed. Waiting felt like negligence. Doing nothing had become the most frightening option. Meanwhile, Aisha continued serving customers, her kindness unchanged, though now grounded by something internal rather than habit alone. The note had given her a sense of acknowledgement she had not realized she lacked. She found herself standing a little straighter, breathing a little deeper. Even when confronted with impatience or indifference, she felt less diminished by it. Being seen, even anonymously, had reminded her of her own worth beyond function. The café absorbed these parallel tensions quietly. To customers, it remained a place of coffee and conversation, unaware of the subtle currents shaping its atmosphere. To those working within it, every small interaction felt charged with meaning. Aisha and the manager moved through the same space carrying opposing responses to uncertainty, one softened by connection, the other hardened by caution. Neither was wrong, yet their paths diverged in how they interpreted risk and care. As evening approached, Aisha found a moment alone near the window, light fading outside. She took out the note briefly, reading it once more before folding it carefully. She did not romanticize it. She did not imagine promises where none were written. Instead, she accepted it as a moment of recognition, a reminder that her quiet labor reached beyond immediate sight. That acceptance felt grounding, not intoxicating, allowing her to remain present rather than distracted by longing. The manager watched the door as night settled, half expecting the man to return. When he did not, unease lingered. He resolved to remain alert, to protect what stability remained. His planning brought him a measure of control, even if answers were still absent. He believed that preparedness could compensate for uncertainty, that structure could guard against unseen threats. When closing time arrived, the café dimmed into its familiar quiet. Aisha cleaned with care, the note secure in her pocket, its meaning resting lightly rather than pressing for action. The manager locked up, his mind still working, strategies forming. Both carried the day with them, shaped differently by the same events. The shy exchange had passed unnoticed by most, yet it left traces behind, altering inner landscapes without disturbing the surface. Within the café's walls, warmth and suspicion coexisted, waiting to see which would shape what came next. The rumors did not arrive loudly. They slipped into the café the way cold air did through a door left open too long, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. Aisha sensed the shift before anyone spoke to her directly. It lived in pauses that lasted a second too long, in glances exchanged when she approached, in conversations that softened or stopped entirely as she passed. The café still functioned, cups still clinked, orders were still taken, but something invisible had rearranged the emotional furniture, leaving her unsure where she belonged. At first, she tried to dismiss the feeling. Stress made people strange, and uncertainty had sharpened everyone's edges. But patterns emerged. A coworker who once shared jokes during slow hours now responded with brief nods. Another avoided eye contact altogether, assigning herself tasks far from Aisha's section. Even small gestures, like the absence of casual assistance during a rush, began to weigh on her. Kindness, she learned again, was most noticeable in its absence. The rumors found shape in fragments she overheard while refilling supplies or passing the break area. Words like favoritism, secret customer, special attention floated without context, stitched together by imagination rather than fact. No one accused her outright, but the implications settled heavily. In a place where everyone felt precarious, the idea that someone might receive unseen advantage stirred resentment. Aisha understood that fear often sought targets, yet knowing this did not soften its impact. She searched herself for some misstep, replaying recent days with careful honesty. Had she lingered too long at a table, smiled too openly, accepted something she should not have? The answer remained no. Her behavior had not changed, only how it was interpreted. That realization hurt more than guilt would have. It meant she could not correct the situation through action alone. Perception had already decided its version of events. The café's warmth thinned further, replaced by a brittle politeness that felt transactional. Conversations turned practical, stripped of ease. Aisha felt her voice grow quieter, not from shyness but from a desire to take up less space. Isolation crept in subtly, wrapping itself around her routines. She continued working with care, but the effort felt heavier now, as if each act of kindness required justification rather than being assumed as natural. Across the room, the disguised man noticed the change with growing unease. He watched the way interactions stiffened around her, how smiles no longer reached eyes. His presence, once intended to remain neutral, now felt like a disturbance rippling outward. He recognized the pattern all too well. Power, even unclaimed, altered dynamics. Attention, even anonymous, created imbalance. The café, delicate in its current state, absorbed the consequences quickly. He observed Aisha closely, noting how she carried herself through the shift. There was no bitterness in her movements, only restraint. She did not confront anyone, did not seek sympathy. Instead, she withdrew slightly, preserving dignity where connection had faltered. That quiet endurance unsettled him more than open conflict would have. It revealed the cost of misunderstanding borne silently by those least equipped to defend themselves. The manager, too, sensed the tension, though he interpreted it differently. He attributed the strain to workload and anxiety, missing the personal undercurrent weaving through the staff. His focus remained outward, on threats he could name and plan against. The internal fracture went unnoticed, growing in the spaces between people who no longer trusted each other's intentions. Leadership, stretched thin, failed to see how easily suspicion could turn inward when left without clarity. Aisha felt the café become a place she moved through rather than belonged to. Breaks were spent alone, tasks completed without comment. She reminded herself that this job was not her entire life, yet it had been a sanctuary once, a place where quiet effort felt valued. Losing that sense of belonging reopened old wounds, reminding her how easily stability could slip away without explanation. The disguised man felt responsibility settle heavier with each passing hour. He had wanted to understand, to observe without influence, but neutrality proved impossible. His silence had allowed others to fill gaps with assumption. He considered revealing himself, explaining, correcting the narrative, yet restraint held him back. Sudden truth could fracture what little balance remained. Intervention, he knew, required care, timing, and humility, not impulse. As the day wore on, Aisha's isolation deepened, but she did not allow it to harden her. When customers arrived, she offered the same gentle attention, even as coworkers watched from a distance. Her kindness, now scrutinized, became an act of quiet defiance. She refused to let judgment rewrite who she was. Still, the effort drained her, leaving little energy for anything beyond survival. The café mirrored her fatigue. Laughter disappeared entirely, replaced by efficient silence. Even the music seemed subdued, its volume lowered without anyone noticing. The space felt smaller, as if walls had inched closer together. Everyone worked, but no one connected. In that emotional narrowing, misunderstandings thrived, feeding on the absence of open conversation. Near the end of the shift, the disguised man stood to leave, his decision heavy. He paused, looking once more at Aisha, who was wiping a table with methodical care. She did not look up. He understood then that good intentions did not absolve unintended harm. Watching was not neutral. Distance was not harmless. His presence, meant to learn, had altered lives already burdened by uncertainty. When the door closed behind him, the café remained tense, but something settled within him. Recognition did not fix the damage, but it clarified his role. Responsibility could no longer remain abstract or postponed. Inside, Aisha finished her shift quietly, feeling the ache of being misunderstood but holding on to her sense of self. The day ended without resolution, yet within its discomfort lay a fragile truth. Warmth could be threatened by judgment, but it did not vanish entirely. It waited, resilient, for understanding to return and make space for it again. The decision settled over him quietly, without drama, as he stood outside the café watching the familiar door open and close. He understood now that observation without accountability was a form of avoidance. The place he had built, reduced on paper to numbers and projections, lived here in gestures and anxieties he could no longer ignore. Stepping inside again, he felt the weight of intention sharpen his focus. This time, he did not take the corner seat. He approached the counter with purpose measured enough not to alarm, yet firm enough to carry meaning. The manager noticed immediately. There was something different in the man's posture, a steadiness that suggested resolve rather than curiosity. When their eyes met, the manager felt the same unease that had followed him for days, now clarified into expectation. The man asked politely for a private moment. The request was calm, unassuming, yet it carried authority not rooted in tone but in certainty. Against his instincts, the manager agreed, guiding him toward the back with guarded composure. In the quieter space, away from customers and staff, the man spoke plainly. He did not announce himself with flourish. He stated who he was and why he had come, his voice steady, stripped of justification. He explained his absence, his choice to observe anonymously, his need to understand what his distance had created. The manager listened in silence, shock registering slowly, like a delayed echo. Recognition brought relief and fear in equal measure. The unseen owner had been present all along, watching, measuring, forming conclusions. Caution returned quickly. The manager asked questions, careful and direct, seeking confirmation rather than reassurance. He had learned that power often revealed itself strategically, not always honestly. The man answered without defensiveness, acknowledging mistakes rather than excusing them. He did not ask for loyalty. He asked for truth. That request unsettled the manager more than commands ever could. Honesty, he knew, carried consequences no plan could fully contain. They spoke of the café's atmosphere, of staff anxiety, of rumors and fractures the manager had struggled to control. The man listened without interruption, absorbing details that statistics never conveyed. He heard about fear disguised as efficiency, about kindness strained by suspicion. When Aisha's name surfaced, the man did not react outwardly, but the mention carried weight. He asked about her not as an exception but as an example. The manager hesitated, then spoke carefully, describing her work, her restraint, the tension that had grown around her without clear cause. Understanding settled between them, heavy but clarifying. The man acknowledged that his silence had contributed to instability, that observation without guidance had allowed misunderstandings to grow. He did not promise immediate solutions. Instead, he expressed intent to remain present, to listen before acting. The manager nodded slowly, torn between relief and apprehension. Stability might return, but change often arrived with its own disruptions. Still, he recognized sincerity when he heard it. The café had needed this conversation longer than either of them realized. Out front, Aisha continued working, unaware of the shift unfolding beyond her sight. She moved through the café with the same quiet diligence, responding to customers with warmth unaltered by the weight she carried. The rumors still lingered, the distance among co-workers still present, yet she did not allow it to reshape her behavior. Kindness for her was not a strategy. It was a practice, repeated even when it offered no immediate reward. She wiped tables, refilled cups, listened without interruption. Her isolation remained, but she bore it with a dignity that asked for nothing. The café felt tense, yet she treated it as she always had, a shared space deserving care. She did not know that decisions forming in the back room would soon ripple outward, touching her life in ways she could not anticipate. For now, she existed fully in the present, anchored by routine and self-respect. The man and the manager returned to the front separately. Nothing obvious changed. Orders continued, machines hummed, customers chatted. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. Authority had re-entered the space not as control but as accountability. The manager felt the burden he carried lighten slightly, replaced by cautious optimism. He watched Aisha from a distance, seeing her now through a different lens, aware that her experience represented more than individual resilience. It reflected the cost of neglect. The man lingered briefly, not as a watcher but as someone present. He did not approach Aisha, did not disrupt her work. He observed with intention shaped by responsibility rather than curiosity. Every interaction reinforced what he had learned. This cafe thrived not because of branding or investment, but because people like her sustained it daily. That truth demanded response, not admiration alone. When he left, it was with clarity rather than secrecy. The manager stood at the counter, processing the encounter, already considering how to rebuild trust without exposing fragile truths too quickly. He understood that leadership now required repair, not surveillance. The cafe would need time to breathe again, to remember itself beyond fear. As the day drew toward evening, Aisha felt a quiet steadiness return, subtle but real. Nothing external had changed, yet the air felt marginally lighter, as if pressure had eased without announcement. She did not question it. Some shifts were felt before they were understood. She finished her tasks, unaware that her sincerity had already altered the trajectory of forces far larger than her. The truth had begun to surface, not through revelation, but through presence and listening. The cafe remained imperfect, its tensions unresolved, but a foundation had been laid quietly. Aisha worked on, grounded in who she was, while unseen decisions gathered shape. Change approached not as spectacle, but as consequence, patient and deliberate, waiting for the right moment to step fully into the light. Mr. Saad remained seated at the small corner table long after the morning rush thinned, allowing the cafe to settle into its quieter rhythm. Without the shield of authority or recognition, he noticed details he had ignored for years. The way the floor creaked unevenly near the counter, the faint smell of burnt sugar clinging to the air, the tired patience in the staff's movements. From this ordinary seat, the cafe did not feel like an asset or a brand. It felt like a living organism held together by routines and unspoken sacrifices, and the realization unsettled him more than any balance sheet ever had. He watched Aisha move between tables with the same care she had shown since his first disguised visit. Her gestures were small but deliberate, her posture slightly guarded, as if she had learned to occupy as little space as possible. She offered courtesy without expectation, a quiet steadiness that did not fluctuate with mood or attention. Mr. Saad sensed that this consistency was not naive kindness but something practiced, shaped by years of learning that dignity often had to be self-maintained. Seeing her work without awareness of who observed her made him feel both humbled and exposed. Around her, the cafe's inner dynamics unfolded naturally. The manager maintained order through habit rather than inspiration, enforcing rules that were safe and familiar. Some staff members worked efficiently yet mechanically, their loyalty tied to schedules and paychecks. Others carried subtle frustrations, revealed in tight smiles or hurried movements. Mr. Saad noticed how easily minor tensions passed unnoticed when one looked only at reports. Here, stripped of titles, he saw how leadership was felt rather than declared, and how absence could reveal more than presence. The weight of his own distance pressed on him as he reflected on how rarely he had allowed himself to simply observe. Wealth had insulated him, giving him options while quietly stealing context. Decisions had been made from quiet offices, framed as necessary and rational, yet detached from the textures of daily effort. Sitting among customers who treated him as invisible, he sensed the cost of that separation. It was not just inefficiency or missed potential, but a moral thinning, a gradual forgetting of why the cafe existed at all. Aisha paused briefly near the counter, adjusting a chipped saucer before returning it to the shelf. The gesture was unremarkable, yet it carried a care that felt almost intimate. Mr. Saad understood then that her dedication was not fueled by loyalty to ownership but by respect for the space and the people within it. This distinction struck him deeply. He had assumed that incentives and oversight were the foundations of commitment, yet here was proof that meaning could grow independently of control. As the hours passed, he noted how the staff supported one another in quiet ways. A nod exchanged during a rush, a cup of water placed within reach, a momentary pause to share a breath. These gestures formed a fragile network of trust that had developed despite, not because of, his distant stewardship. The cafe functioned because its people adapted to gaps in leadership, filling them with their own resilience. This realization carried both admiration and guilt, as he recognized how often necessity had forced them into self-reliance. He thought about the language he used in meetings, words like efficiency, scalability, and optimization, and how little space they left for fatigue, pride, or fear. Those terms now felt thin compared to the lived reality unfolding before him. Each shift demanded emotional labor that never appeared in metrics, yet without it the cafe would collapse into something cold and transactional. Mr. Saad felt a growing responsibility not to disrupt this balance with grand reforms, but to understand it slowly, respectfully, and with restraint. The idea of leadership began to reshape itself in his mind, no longer as command, but as attentive presence and shared accountability. By afternoon, his internal conflict settled into something heavier than surprise. He no longer felt the urge to correct or command. Instead, he felt an unfamiliar responsibility to listen. Observing without interference had revealed a truth he could not ignore. Authority untempered by presence created blind spots, and success measured only by profit eroded the human foundation that sustained it. The cafe's warmth, he realized, came from endurance rather than design. The day carried on with small interruptions and ordinary noises, yet for Mr. Saad everything felt newly weighted. He sensed that any future change would have to move at the pace of trust, not ambition. The thought steadied him, easing the impatience he had long mistaken for drive. For the first time in years, he felt aligned with the place he owned, not as a figure above it, but as someone accountable to its quiet truths and shared responsibilities. This understanding did not feel like redemption, only a starting point marked by restraint. He accepted that trust could not be purchased or announced. It would be earned through consistency, apology when necessary, and the humility to remain present even when recognition was uncomfortable or absent entirely for him over time daily without shortcuts or symbolic gestures at last quietly. Aisha finished her shift with the same quiet composure, gathering her things without fanfare. She left behind no trace of expectation, only the steady impression of someone who gave her best regardless of recognition. Watching her exit into the evening light, Mr. Saad understood that change would not come from dramatic gestures or sudden revelations. It would require patience, humility, and a willingness to rebuild trust from within. When he finally stood to leave, the cafe felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. He carried with him a clearer understanding of his role, no longer as a distant owner, but as a participant who had much to relearn. The decision formed quietly, without triumph or urgency. He would stay, observe, and begin again, knowing that true value was measured in people, not possessions. Mr. Saad waited until the afternoon lull, when the cafe's noise softened into a gentle murmur and the air felt less sharp, as if the room itself was exhaling. He stood near the counter, watching Aisha move between tables with the quiet steadiness that had become the cafe's true heartbeat. The light from the windows fell on her hair and the edge of her apron, turning ordinary motions into something almost reverent. He had been absent for weeks, and in that time the staff had learned to keep the place running without him. But the warmth that once felt natural had thinned, replaced by a cautious politeness and the quiet tension of people who had begun to doubt the future. He had come back not because he wanted applause, but because he could no longer ignore the ache in his own conscience. He had watched the cafe from the corner, as if he were a stranger in his own property, and he had seen the way Aisha kept the room alive with a simple kindness that did not ask for anything in return. He knew that his wealth had made him distant, and he feared that his absence had made him irrelevant. Now, as he stood there, he felt the weight of all the unspoken things between them, and he realized he could not pretend that distance was harmless anymore. Aisha was wiping a table near the window when he approached, and she looked up with the same instinctive politeness she offered every customer. Her surprise showed in the slight pause of her breath, in the way her eyes widened before she could settle them into the calm mask she wore at work. For a moment she did not speak, as if the idea of the owner addressing her directly was too large to fit into her usual routine. In the past he had been a name, a signature on papers, a figure who appeared only in brief, formal moments, and his absence had made that distance feel even wider. He cleared his throat softly, not to demand attention but to soften the awkwardness between them. His voice was low, careful, as if he was speaking to someone fragile. He apologized, and the apology startled her more than any accusation could have. It was not the kind of apology that tried to excuse his absence or shift blame onto circumstances. It was simple and direct, as if he had finally accepted that his wealth and position did not protect him from being responsible. He said he was sorry for neglecting the cafe, for leaving the staff in uncertainty, and for allowing fear to spread among people who depended on this place for their daily bread. Aisha listened, her hands still resting on the cloth, her body composed but her mind moving too fast. She had learned to expect distance from people in power, to accept that their lives ran on different schedules and that their priorities were not meant to align with hers. The cafe had been a place where she could be useful without being seen, and she had grown accustomed to that invisibility, even when it hurt. Hearing an apology from the owner felt like a strange gift, one she did not know how to receive. She looked at him as if trying to decide whether this moment was real or simply another version of the same distant story. He spoke about the cafe as if it were more than an investment, as if it were a small world that required care. He said he had been watching, not to judge but to understand. He admitted that he had underestimated the value of the people who kept the place alive. He mentioned Aisha's consistency, the way she treated customers with respect even when they were rude or dismissive, and he confessed that he had failed to recognize the emotional labor in her work. He said he had been wrong to assume kindness was simply part of the job, something that could be demanded without understanding the cost. His voice trembled slightly when he said that he had allowed his own distance to become a barrier between him and the very people who had made his cafe what it was. Aisha felt something shift inside her, like a door opening that she had kept closed out of necessity. She had never asked for recognition, yet she realized she had always wanted it, quietly, like a person wants to be seen without having to demand it. The apology did not erase the weeks of uncertainty, but it offered a kind of closure she had not expected. She had been carrying the burden of rumors and fear, trying to keep others calm while her own emotions remained locked away. Now someone acknowledged her truth without making her prove it. She responded with the kind of honesty that had become rare in her life. She told him that his absence had made the staff anxious, that rumors had spread, and that the cafe's warmth had dimmed. She did not accuse him harshly, but she did not soften her words either. Her voice remained calm, but the truth in it was clear. She spoke of how the staff had begun to distrust one another, how she had felt isolated, how her own work had been interpreted as favoritism, and how the fear of losing jobs had turned the atmosphere brittle. Mr. Saad listened without interruption, absorbing each sentence. He did not defend himself, did not offer excuses, and the act of listening felt like a form of respect. When she finished, he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had been afraid to admit. He said he understood, and the simplicity of the phrase made it feel sincere. He acknowledged that he had failed to provide stability, and that his silence had allowed fear to grow. He promised to do better, not with grand gestures but with consistent presence, with the humility to learn from the people who worked for him, and with the willingness to rebuild trust from the ground up. Aisha felt relief settle in her chest like a breath she had been holding for weeks. She did not know if she could trust him completely yet, but she felt that the first step had been taken. Her shock was not only because he had approached her, but because he had approached her as a human being rather than a distant owner. His apology had removed the distance between them, at least for a moment, and that removal made space for something that had been missing: mutual understanding. They stood there for a few more moments, not speaking, letting the cafe's sounds fill the space between them. The hum of machines, the murmur of customers, the soft clink of cups. All of it felt more alive now, as if the room had regained its natural rhythm. Aisha felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. She looked at Mr. Saad and saw not a distant owner but a person who had made a mistake and was trying to correct it. That recognition did not erase the past, but it made the future feel less uncertain. When he finally stepped back, he did so with quiet respect, giving her space rather than demanding a response. Aisha returned to her work, her movements steady, but her mind calmer. The apology had not solved everything, yet it had created a bridge. She felt relieved, Not because her life had changed instantly, but because someone had finally acknowledged her truth. The cafe remained imperfect and alive, and within its ordinary rhythm, a moment of understanding had taken root, leaving room for healing to begin. She carried that hope with her, knowing trust would take time but was now possible. The cafe's atmosphere had finally begun to settle back into its familiar rhythm, but the rhythm itself felt different, as if the music had changed just slightly. Still the same melody, yet softer, warmer, more human. The morning rush returned with its usual clatter of cups and the hiss of the espresso machine, but the tension that had been hanging in the air for weeks was gone, replaced by a quiet steadiness. People moved through the space with the kind of ease that comes when a place is no longer threatened, when the fear of change has been replaced by the comfort of continuity. The staff no longer rushed with anxious faces, and even the regular customers seemed calmer, as if they too could feel that something in the cafe had shifted. Not the decor, not the menu, not even the service, but the underlying sense that this place belonged to more than just a brand. It belonged to everyone who spent their days there, from the ones who worked with their hands to the ones who sat in the corners sipping their drinks like they owned the world. Now, the cafe felt like a small, breathing community again, and that feeling was the most valuable thing it had ever offered. Mr. Saad's return had not come with fanfare or announcements, but his presence was felt like a gentle change in the air. He didn't walk in like a man reclaiming a property. He moved through the cafe as someone who had finally come back to a place he had neglected. He still wore his expensive coat and his quiet confidence, but there was a softness in his expression that had not been there before. He didn't command the room. He simply existed in it, observing and listening. His gaze drifted toward the staff more often than it used to, not with the sharp scrutiny of a boss checking on performance, but with the careful attention of someone who had realized that the people who kept his cafe alive were not just employees, but human beings with stories, fears, and pride. It was a realization that had not come easily, and it had changed him in a way that could not be undone by money or power. Aisha noticed the change first in the way he spoke to the staff. He no longer treated them as if they were merely part of the machinery that made his business run. He started asking how they were, not in a shallow manner, but with genuine interest. He made an effort to remember names and small details. He even apologized for the uncertainty his absence had caused, and for the way the cafe had been left in a state of confusion. For the first time, the staff heard the owner speak like a person who understood the cost of his absence. It wasn't just the words that mattered, but the tone, the humility in his voice, the fact that he had taken the time to come down from his high office and face the reality he had ignored. This quiet respect did not erase the past, but it began to repair it. Aisha's own feelings were complicated. She had been shocked when he returned, and even more shocked when he treated her with a level of respect she had never expected. She had been taught by life to stay small, to not hope for recognition, because recognition often came with disappointment. But now, when Mr. Saad looked at her as if she mattered, something inside her loosened. She felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief, like someone had finally acknowledged her existence in a world that usually ignored people like her. She had always served with kindness, not because she expected anything in return, but because it was the only way she knew how to remain human in a job that could easily strip a person of their soul. Yet even she had never imagined that her quiet kindness could reach the owner of the cafe, the man whose life was so distant from hers that it seemed like a different world. Now, that distance felt smaller, not because he had become like her, but because he had finally looked toward her with honesty. The staff felt the change too, and it altered the dynamics of the cafe in ways that were subtle but powerful. There was no longer the quiet fear of being replaced. No more rumors about the cafe being sold or shut down. The manager, who had been tense and defensive for weeks, seemed to relax. He still ran the place with discipline, but now there was less suspicion in his eyes and more collaboration. He no longer looked at the staff like a group of workers he needed to control. He looked at them like a team he needed to support. The jealousy that had been building among some of the employees began to dissolve, not because the cause of jealousy had disappeared, but because the air of uncertainty that fed it was gone. When people feel secure, they stop measuring each other's worth in whispers. They begin to see each other as people again, not as competitors in a small world where survival depends on favoritism. For Aisha, the most significant change was not the owner's presence, but the new sense of value she felt within herself. She had always been kind, but kindness had often felt like a fragile thing, easily broken by the harshness of life. Now, her kindness felt like strength. She began to stand a little taller, not in arrogance, but in quiet confidence. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. She stopped shrinking her smile when customers looked at her with impatience. She began to speak more freely, not loudly, but with a calm certainty that came from feeling seen. The cafe had become a place where she could be more than just a waitress. It had become a place where her humanity was recognized. The disguised visit had become a turning point for everyone, though no one spoke of it openly. The memory of the unknown man who had sat quietly in the corner, watching and then vanished, was still present in the cafe's atmosphere. It had made everyone realize that the cafe was not just a business, but a small world where lives intersected. It had shown the staff that their work mattered beyond the wage they received. It had shown Mr. Saad that his wealth could not replace his presence, and that the cafe's true value lay in the people who kept it alive. Even the customers seemed to sense the change, as if the cafe now offered something more than luxury and taste. It offered warmth, and in a world where so much is transactional, warmth was becoming rare. As the days passed, the cafe's warmth returned, not as a temporary relief, but as a lasting shift. Mr. Saad began to treat the staff with more respect and more patience. He learned their names, their stories, and their struggles. He started to take responsibility for the uncertainty he had caused, and he did not try to fix it with money or promises. Instead, he chose to rebuild trust slowly, by showing up, listening, and treating everyone as a person rather than a resource. Aisha noticed this and felt her heart lighten. She understood that the cafe had become more than a job for her. It had become a place where she belonged, where her quiet kindness was not a weakness but a gift. In the evenings, when the last customer left and the lights dimmed, the cafe no longer felt like a place waiting for something to happen. It felt like a home that had been restored. The staff cleaned the tables together, not out of obligation but out of shared care. Aisha stayed a little longer, savoring the calm, the sound of the vacuum cleaner, the smell of the last espresso, and the soft murmur of conversation that had become part of the cafe's soul. She knew the future was still uncertain in many ways, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope that was not tied to someone else's actions. It was a hope she could carry within herself. And so the cafe continued, not as a mere business, but as a place of genuine care. The relationships had changed, and in that change, something beautiful had been born. Aisha's quiet kindness had finally found its place in the world, not because it was rewarded, but because it was finally recognized. And as the cafe's doors closed for the night, the warmth inside remained, steady and true, promising that this new beginning was not just a moment, but a path forward.